Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tariq Masood. I'm a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and the faculty director of our Middle East Initiative. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, the fourth in a series of conversations being led by Middle East Initiative Senior Fellow James Snyder on art and culture in the Middle East. I'm going to turn it over to James in a moment for him to introduce tonight's guest, the distinguished and decorated Palestinian architect, Senan Abdelqader. But I just wanted to give everybody a brief sense of what it is we are doing in this series. This series has two goals. The first is for us to explore a dimension of life and society, Middle Eastern societies, that uh, moves beyond the political and gets us in touch with art and culture and a whole host of things that are not ordinarily the set of concerns that we focus on here in the Middle East Initiative. The second goal of these events, I think, is to have our audience be in touch and in communion with one of the great minds and great communicators in the world of art and culture, and that is our host for this evening, James Snyder. So I will now turn it over to James. Thank you, James.
Tarek, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you always for such nice words. You know, this is the end of our first season of these talks. And of course, when we envisioned them, we thought that once a month we would be in Cambridge, we would gather together in person. These would be opportunities to bring great and articulate personalities from the Middle East to be with us together in Cambridge. It's happened a little bit in a different way. I have to say that it's actually been a lot of fun through this season. And of course, we're already looking forward to the next. This evening is the closing talk for this season. Just by way of reprise, we started 3 months ago with the conversation between Tarek and me, which was called Power of Place. And that conversation was really about the influence of landscape and architecture on one's worldview. You know, for me, it was about my personal experience in growing up and how notions of landscape and architecture really inform my thinking going forward. And it's something that stays thrilling for me all the time. From that, we moved to our second conversation, which reflected on notions of monotheism and how times like today resonate with the times when monotheism was invented in the Middle East, and the narrative from 3,000 years ago to today, and really the incredible resonances between the challenges of those times and challenges of today. And then last month, our conversation was about Israel and Palestine on screen, talking about interpreting the complexities of today's Middle East, doing so with honesty and accuracy, and surfacing personal and emotional narratives and truths through the mediums of film and television. Tonight, our conversation is called Antique Inspirations, New Creations. It's going to be a kind of synthesis of all of the conversations that preceded this one throughout the fall. And this evening is really going to be about the narrative of an evolving vocabulary of art, architecture, and design across the Middle Eastern landscape. And really, this is a story that is exactly about the power of place and the story of power of place set against the backdrop of the times in which vocabularies for art, architecture, and design are created. You know, we could start this conversation way back in biblical times. We could talk about wandering in the desert. We could talk about the first cities in the Middle East, but we're not going to go back that far. We're really going to come more to the modern era. I think we'll start with the Ottoman period and we'll come into the time of the British Mandate in Palestine and the founding of the State of Israel. And then we'll come to the architecture today that is across the landscape, or we might say the landscapes of Israel and Palestine today. We couldn't actually have a better speaker for this conversation than Senan Abdelqader, who is a really superb architect born in Taipei, which is an Arab town in central Israel. Senan started his academic studies actually in civil engineering, and he left Israel to go to Hamburg in Germany in order to begin his studies. He studied architecture in Germany. In 1995, he opened his first studio in Jerusalem. And then 20 years later, in 2015, he moved his studio to Jaffa. He's taught through all these years at Bezalel, the Academy of Art and Design in Jerusalem. And actually, he was the first Palestinian to be designated a professor in Israel in 2016. His focused teaching is very interesting and entirely tied to our subjects for this evening. His focus tends to be on notions of the formal and the informal, or notions of urbanism, but informal urbanism, and then notions of rural and urban, the contrast between and the resonances between rural and urban landscapes. This is a kind of introduction to what our conversation is going to be about. And really, I want this to be a back and forth between the two of us. So I'm going to start even now with questions for Senan. And my first is, from Taipei as a little kid, how did you zero in so quickly on the idea of leaving the country to go to Germany to study engineering?
Well, first of all, good evening, and thank you for this invitation and for the kind introduction. My family background is a little bit complicated, since it's go through, moving from place to place before 1948 in Palestine under the British mandate, and later on in Israel, going or moving to Taipei. Originally, my family comes from near Jaffa, the well-known Arab Jewish city today. It's a part of Tel Aviv. And I think that it was a big influence of my childhood, being between these two geographic or those places between the urban, as you mentioned, and the rural places. I'd surprise you if I say that you mentioned that I started studying civil engineer in Europe, but I goes to Europe first with a notion, or actually with the hobby of which I have had as a child, playing with camera as a cameraman, and later on was my interest to be a regisseur. And for this, there were very limited opportunity to study in Israel and to have a liberation. So I decided to go to Germany to study there. I found myself after 1 year of having language courses in German and meeting different people who influenced actually my start that time, by convincing me to go to a realistic, if you can say, practical profession. And that was not the time for cinema. So I don't know how I came to civil engineer exactly, but later I found myself through the civil engineer field going to architecture. So this is how it started, actually. And I stayed there for 15 years, finishing my study and to the second degree, and then I started to work there in Germany for a while.
It's funny because, Senan, you and I we speak to one another quite often, and our conversations can be conceptual and ideological. It's funny to think that your career path was based on pragmatism. What I find really interesting, though, is that whenever we speak, somehow our conversation about history in the region goes back to the Ottoman time. And, the Ottoman Empire was vast. It reached deep into Europe. It reached into the West. And today, many architects, most architects that we know in Israel have studied there. Their careers began there. And for me, it's really fascinating that you went to Europe and you stayed. I mean, really, you started your practice there before you came back to be in the Middle East. And I'm wondering if going to Europe, being in Germany, absorbing your education there, seeing the landscape and the built landscape there, did this give you a sense of grounding in the resonance between the East and the West, which is really a lot of what the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East was about? It was about bringing the West to the East. And that's really what the continuing story that we'll talk about from that moment into the mandate period to today is about.
Well, let me say that actually I don't like very much the dichotomy East and West, but anyway, of course, there were a big influence on our part of the world, beginning the modern era, gaining the tools from the Eurocentric knowledge, and that began also in the Ottoman Empire era in 1820. So I think that the modernism began also in Palestine. At that time, many of our professional people goes to Europe to study, and I think this influenced the language we use later. And of course, when I came in the 80s to Europe, it was so technically and you know, in each sense was very advanced, that I profit from this you know, study in German, and I can say that I still carry in my background a lot of what I've learned in Europe in general, but specifically in Germany, and you know about the influence of the international steel and the Bauhaus and so on. They're still part of how I do think and analyze my way of work, or the way I do think. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting that you've zeroed in exactly on that and on this period of international modernism coming to the Middle East. And of course, this happened during the Mandate. It happened between the wars, because all of these architects who were absorbing international modernism came to Palestine. And their coming there and their arrival there happened to coincide with this period of the Mandate. And for me, it's a really fascinating time, because I'm a sort of dyed-in-the-wool international modernist. And when we moved to Israel, and I saw the remnants of all of this architecture from that period, and for me, it's quite stunning. And there are lots of examples that are especially stunning. And we're going to talk about this for a little bit, but my first question about this is to wonder how, in your own work, this notion of bringing that language of international modernism from the heart of Europe to the Middle East during the time of the Mandate, how much that means to you and how much of an influence it has on you and your work.
Yeah, honestly, before I came to Europe, I have had no idea about architecture in general, as I mentioned, but also, and especially about the modern architecture, or to differentiate between the local architecture, what I experience in the rural side, and the urban one, which it was already in those modern cities in Palestine, Haifa, Jerusalem, Jaffa, Beersheba, and so on. These cities today, nowadays, are mixed cities, Jewish and Arab. And the modernism started already in the Ottoman era, where actually the cities were connected, and with the railway trains and There were also a new institution established, and there were also European architects who brought from Italian, France, and England to do architecture. So this began in the about 200 years ago. And I realized I would say, the similarity when I came back after I studied architecture, how that shaped our space and the Orient context. And of course, it's still also what we call in Germany Maßstab. I mean how you call it, the scale. The scale of the space is very influenced, since it was a kind of transformation from a very small scale into middle scale, and nowadays the large scale. So these different scales are part of this environment transformation, and I think this is what mainly possible by moving from in the history toward the modernism, and still, of course, working on our cities and shaped our cities, and yeah, I think that you can't imagine the place now without having this background of architecture.
You know, Senan, before you left to go to Germany, before you went to study there, did you have a sense of this meaning of architecture, of this power of architecture, as you would travel around in Israel as a kid, as you would go from Taipei to Tel Aviv to Haifa? You know, when Tina and I first arrived in Israel in the mid-1990s, of course, this was part of for us, this was part of our vocabulary. It was part of our thinking. So we were stunned to see these very powerful examples. But do you recall, as a young guy, just seeing these buildings? Did they move you in any way?
Yeah, of course. I mean, moving from rural sites, from small towns in Palestine, going to the big city, and of course, Tel Aviv, for example, as a Bauhaus city, was very attracting and special to me. But also, if you look at Jerusalem, which has the mandate architecture, there was a contrast between these two cities. One is very liberal and the other is conservative. So this also gave me quite to understand the differences between the social aspects of these cities and so on.
You know, I want to take just one example from that period, and let's talk about, for a moment, let's talk about the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem, which the Israel Museum is proud to be the custodian of the Rockefeller Museum. We're just going to look at two images here for a moment. Here's one of the front of the building, and then we'll just look at one which is of the interior courtyard. And go back for a moment to the facade, to the front of the building. So, you know, this was built by Austin St. Barb Harrison, who was the classic mandate modernist who came from the UK to build the Rockefeller Museum. And it was built in the late 1930s in order to house the indigenous archaeology of the ancient Near East excavated in the region from Neolithic times to the first temple period, the second temple period, and then to the pre-Islamic period in Jericho, then to the wood-carved panels from the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then to the lintels of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So the idea of this museum, which was a mandate modernist project, was to bring that indigenous narrative to life in the region. We can remove the image now and just continue the conversation. For me, this was a very powerful place. It was like a great ocean-going vessel sitting on a rock, proudly looking over the Temple Mount and the old city. For me, it was always very moving, and I thought of this as a great example of East meets West, of the Ottoman Empire merging with the modern period in the region. But what's your response to that architecture and to the content of the museum?
Yeah, James, of course, it's an iconic architecture, and it's a very special place. But I have to make clear that my first visit there was, of course, after I came back from Germany, and 10 years later, it was 2005, I had been asked to work on the central business district of East Jerusalem, which is very close to the old city, from the northern part of the old city walls. It's actually the area between, who know this, from the Damascus Gate to the Rockefeller Museum until Sheikh Jarrah, which is about 1,000 square dunam. And of course, it's include the Rockefeller Museum itself. And that was the first time I've had to be there in order to think about how to involve or to bring it into the urban ensemble. But this first visit, immediately after I was impressed from the early modernism in our region, I immediately, I have to say, lost this enthusiasm, and it was transformed into a kind of disappointment, because it's actually symbolized to me the power and the authority in this place. There were no Arab there, actually. There were some maybe worker who are going in the corridors, but all of scientific and people who managed to govern in this place were Israeli, who actually control the heritage, the Arab heritage, that I can't have a real, touch to it or an access. And when I want to do any or give any idea about the architecture of this place, to connect it to the surrounding urban site, it was very difficult, because they were very conservative to agree or to accept this kind of idea, to open it to the public in sense of continuous space. I mean, the background of this facade you've shown, there is a big garden which is not accessible for the residential or the residents surround this area. So it is really a kind of iconic building, but it's separated from its surrounding area. This is the feeling that you have there. This is how I do know it.
You're speaking exactly to a point that I want to stay with for a little bit, because for me, as a museologist, Rockefeller Museum is something really quite extraordinary, because it celebrates the indigenous culture of where it is. It was built to accomplish that. And frankly, today, almost 100 years later, it's one of the few examples remaining throughout the Middle East of this kind of colonial museology, built by another culture, but on site in order to preserve and give reverence to the culture of a place. At the same time, you're right, it stands proudly on a rock overlooking the old city, but in a way, it is more like a fortress than it is like a celebration, like an ocean-going vessel that celebrates its presence on the sea. That is true. Again, at the same time, it is there, and it really preserves the heritage of where it is. Politically, it's quite interesting. It was built in 1938 during the Mandate. In 1948, it became part of Jordan. In 1967, it was put under the custodianship of Israel. And since that time, the Israel Museum has been its keeper. And the museum is its keeper with the responsibility to preserve it intact for the future, so that that art and archaeological history remains. At the same time, there is really a question of how it relates to our architecture and urban planning for where it is and for the urban and rural landscape of people who live where it is. You know, in all of your own focus, in your academic focus, which is always about the formal, the informal, the rural, and the urban, how does your thinking about all of that relate to an appreciation for what's happened to architecture since 1948 and the founding of the state, and through today, where it really is about defining an architecture for Israel today and for Palestine today?
Well, first, let me just make a note about the preservation terminology. This is a quite big dilemma in general for the Arab culture in Israel, to me, especially when it's come to architecture. Preservation is a quite active controlling again. It's not the culture itself who preserve or even invent or restore it's doing. Someone else who's taking your heritage, your work that you do, and manipulate with it as a museological act. So we are standing there and watching our heritage without being involved in doing this. Not who said that we want to preserve? Maybe we want to renovate or make some transformation of it. So in this sense, the act is very formal in a way that the population, especially the Arab, are not involved in such cultural doing. And because of this, on the other hand, they try to resist their being with creating their own spatial environment. And by this, it's became very informal because they actually do not follow always the rule that the state imposing on their place. Because maybe until the recent 10 years, there were no real urban accurate planning to our Arab space. So there were no exact definition what's urbanity. The state of Israel defined as a rural society. By this, we have to keep a minority, and there is no expansion of the territory. And so you find that most of the population, with the natural growth, they need to expand their space for living. And then you see that most of the built environment is, in this sense, informal. It doesn't follow the rule of urban planning. And there are many towns that it was tolerated. In Jerusalem, it's a special case where the municipality found this as an illegal construction. And then the result was to demolish all of these settlements or informal spaces. And I took it as a challenge to learn about, to bring it to the academy and to show my students that there is also a different kind of architecture that is local culture practicing, and there is no recognition for this kind of architecture. I'm not romanticizing now the way it's done, but there's still a need to understand how it's done in order to know how to maybe legalize this informality and to go with it further to a formal, better architecture.
You know, I really want to stay with this point because I think it comes to where we want our discussion to focus now. And I think I want to look first at Jerusalem, East and West, as a kind of microcosm of what you've just described, but then to look more broadly at Israel and Palestine. You know, in my own view, if you look at Jerusalem, East and West, you know, if you stand at the old city and you look just to the west and just to the east, in the west, you see this evolving architecture, which is the architecture of Israel today. You look to the east and it feels a little bit frozen in time. It's not that things haven't changed there, but you don't feel that change so much.
But if you look at it architecturally in a formal sense, you're right. But I did a study about Jerusalem. I took a strip along east-west, strip from the entrance of the city Jerusalem, where Lifta village is, where Calatrava bridge, until the eastern part of Jerusalem, where the village of Arab al-Sawahir al-Mukabbir, and I found that along the history there were about 6 urban fabrics from the Ottoman era. I'm looking just for during the Ottoman modernism until today, and each of these part of the strip is a kind of completely different city structure. The old city form and pattern began from inside to the outside. I mean, what defined the public space and the pattern is the private construction of houses and even public places or buildings like mosque or other function. And this is what shapes the old city within its old wall. So the Architecture Act is from inside to the outside. It's also explain a different culture vision and culture perspective. When the British colonial came, they actually tried to demolish all the space around the old city in order to keep a green area or zone to make the old city as an object, which is the religious part of the city. And the modern state is actually kept away from the old city in order to have a buffer zone between the old and the new. And by this, there you see that you have a different character of the city, and the old city walls became again like a museological screen instead of touching it as it was in the Ottoman area that you can build on the old city. And this also shows how the urban fabric works under two culture perspective. But in the 30 last years, we see that in the eastern part, there was a natural growth by the Arab community. They build or construct their space without planning. I mean, planning in sense of strategic planning. There were no master plans for urbanity or so on. So it was not frozen. It just looked like something old because it's not well modern organized, if you want. And it's a very different pattern than what you see in the western part of Jerusalem.
You know, it's interesting. I want to continue with
trying not to make very long.
No, and I want to stay with the question of an evolving architectural language today across Jerusalem and across Israel and Palestine. But before that, I want to come back to the mandate for a moment. As a diehard modernist, and this is not a political observation, it's about architecture and urban planning. Some of that mandate modernist architecture is so stunning, you think, what if the mandate had stayed? What would Jerusalem look like today if the mandate had continued? Again, not politically, just in terms of architecture and urban planning. I think you started to say it already, but elaborate on that.
Yeah, no, you know, James, I don't think that colonial, you know, city or architecture have left us ever. It just continued. The Israeli took this rules or how do you call it, the law for constructing and planning and just develop it into modern tools. So Israel tried to be also very European in a way. And also I think the Arab, we didn't succeed to really do this because of what I tried to explain before. We have a formal side of this spectrum of doing, but we have also the informal one, which happened on the Arab side. So even we don't have this mandate, as you call it, period, we're still practicing on this phase of you know what they create for us. And you can see it also in the whole Arab world, in Egypt, in Iraq and Syria. So this heritage culture being rolled, continued actually under the nation state.
You know, and it's interesting because it's two narratives that have to join together. One is about architectural detailing that does emerge from within. And the other, of course, is about broad planning, urban planning, architectural planning, which can also come from without. And that's what you're describing now. And, you know, I want to step for a moment to how we met 10 years ago and why we met, which also takes us to your own architecture. You know, 10 years ago, we were finishing the renewal of the Israel Museum. We had brought Jamie Carpenter from the US to be our architect, and his signature statement for the architecture of the new entrance pavilions as you come into the campus of the museum was all about taking Miesian international modernism, and we do have a few images here so we can show them, and creating a kind of a screen wall. And in Jamie's case, we used, here, go back to the first image, you know, so these are Miesian pavilions with glass curtain walls, but because of the strength of the light in Jerusalem, Jamie created these shade walls, these shade elevations made of glazed extruded terracotta in this louvered elevation design. This is the exterior, and in the next image you see from the interior how it modulates the strength of this light. And then in the next image you see the magic of the space between the glass curtain wall and the louvered elevation that provides shade. And of course, this comes from the history of the mashrabiyah, you know, the screen wall, which was pervasive in Ottoman time. And if you go to the next images, you'll see that exactly when we were building the renewal of the Israel Museum, Senan was completing his mashrabiyah house in Beit Safafa, where he lived in one of the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem, where he created the same mashrabiyah, the same exterior wall, the shade wall, but in his case, as you see in these images, using concrete block to accomplish that goal. And in the third image, which is so magical for me, because for Jamie, it was the space between the glass curtain wall and the terracotta louvers. And for Senan, it was the space between the glass curtain wall and these perforated concrete blocks. And, you know, I read about this story. Jamie was in Jerusalem. We came to meet you, and it was an incredible moment for me because here were two architects, one from here and you from there, one from New York, you from Jerusalem, and interpreting with different materials and different languages, but accomplishing the same goal, which was to create a living environment with modulated light, enjoying and experiencing the intensity of the light of the region, but using architecture to dial that light down in a beneficial way. And I thought it was extremely powerful. And for me, it was all about, it wasn't the big picture of urban planning. It was adapting in a very local way, and yet in a very contemporary way, which is what you were doing then. And for me, it was a very celebratory moment to understand and appreciate that.
Well, thank you for bringing this example. Actually, I can through it describe exactly what I tried to explain before. It's on one hand, it is a kind of creation where the aim of it was to create a catalyst of urbanization by doing this iconic effect of the screen, of this surrounding curtain wall, which is built by or done by concrete construction, very taking it to the very thin dimension, 20 by 20 centimeter column, which is actually fragile, very fragile. But this grid is carrying into it a very heavy stone, which is mass stone, which replaced to me this caricature architecture, which left us, the British left us actually cladding the building with a thin stone like a ceramic. And I wondered always, why do we still use stone in Jerusalem? It's just because this is the law, as we discuss, of the British mandate to bring to Jerusalem this material, and to my how I understand it is to impose it instead of give Jerusalem a little bit liberation from just one material. Anyway, the idea was actually on one hand to go back in our Islamic Arabic history and to find the right element, al-Mashrabiyya, which actually allowed to make a barrier between the private and the public. I mean, when you are inside, you can see outside, but you can't see into inside. This is one thing, one effect which is very important in the traditional Mashrabiyya. But it's, of course, in the history were done by wooden ornamentic. You can see it very much in Cairo, again in Syria or Iraq, cities and architecture. And I use it, transform it into stone. It's actually the first, I would say, stone Mashrabiyya which done in Jerusalem in this scale. It's about 16 meter long and 20 high, and it's on all sides surrounding the building. So it's a huge mass, and it was also to create a place where I can develop by time the program, which was very limited again by the master plan. And it's a kind of a tricky thing where I try to interpret the program with the time inside this screen in order not to be, against the rules. So this Mashrabiyya, it's on one hand, it's in architecture ornamentic in such a big scale, urban scale. On the other hand, it's of course also contain this climate effects by bringing the light inside, and it's also where you have shown the section of the building. You have this gap between the glass screen and the stone screen. You have a chimney effect where the warm air can go up and make a circulation into. So it's also an environmental aspect of architecture. But the main thing was how to somehow to manipulate, bringing a lot of or bigger program as it was allowed in that area. As I mentioned before, there is a limitation of number of units for the Arab neighborhood, and by this I could bring more than what normally you can do in such an Arab neighborhood. We could bring more residential unit into this screen. So it was also served as an example for nowadays. I see that many buildings are imitating this, not in the architecture, but in the concept. So yeah, in this sense, it was necessary to create the Mashrabiyya. From one hand, as a facade, but also as a political statement, if you want.
Well, it's one residential project, but you packed a lot into it. And really, you were synthesizing a long tradition from the Ottoman Empire, from the region, from the Middle East, which was specific to creating comfort in the setting there, but you're using a contemporary vocabulary to accomplish it. And there's magic. And, for me, 10 years ago, it was so thrilling to see that Jamie was creating his own interpretation, given his training and the vocabulary that he created over here in the US, in New York, and was accomplishing or working to accomplish the same goal. And you did accomplish there, and there's a lot of magic to it. How did your neighbors feel about the house? There's a very distinct character to this house, and I don't want to say that the rest of the street has a uniformity to it, but the rest of the street is all of one piece. And what you did, of course, stood out from it. What did the neighbors think?
Well, at the beginning, it was surprising. I mean, very early beginning was also a little bit shocking because in Jerusalem, they used to see this stone facade as a massive one, closed one. And you have always this quadrat opening, very traditional and so on. So they saw this, kind of lattice screen that it was very, refreshing. I think nowadays there is a new young generation who really like it, and many comes there to make a study of it. So it's actually encouraging me to come with these new ideas now. In a conservative place.
Do you feel that a new architectural language is emerging there? Is emerging around you, and do you feel that there is an Israeli vocabulary and a Palestinian vocabulary, or do you see that one vocabulary is emerging that can work across the landscape in an urban setting, in a non-urban setting, and that architects are just looking at that language and evolving together?
Yeah, I would say that many Israeli, of course, Arab architects who looked at this kind of architecture are inspired from it. They brought it also in different places like Jaffa and Haifa, and in different, of course, forms and shapes and technique. But I think the Mashrabi became something, if you are talking about especially the Mashrabi in general.
I'm talking about the Mashrabiyya house as an example, but I'm speaking in general. Do you see now, 10 years later, do you see a new language evolving, which is being embraced broadly by architects?
Yeah, that's what I meant. This was a good example to how you can actually take your history and bring it into the contemporary in a modernizing way of work and technology. So I think, yes, and of course, we have the opportunity to exercise this with our students. Each year I bring, each semester, my student to my project, like the Mashrabiyya, and we are talking, discussing, and I see today that we have I'm teaching about 22 years now, so I have at least one generation where I can now, they are my colleagues, and I see that they bring in fresh architecture, which include also Arab heritage in the local architecture.
You know, you're leading me to the last two questions that I really wanted to raise with you. Some of us, as you know, have this deep-seated devotion to Jerusalem. It is our city. But 5 years ago, you moved your studio from Jerusalem to Jaffa, and you moved your own home from Beit Safafa from Jerusalem to Neve Shalom, which is a more rural setting. Why did you do that?
Well, it's a complicated thing. I didn't tell you that. I mean, the whole story about being in Jerusalem, it was a struggling time. Since my experience was a unique one as an Arab architect who have had the opportunity to work with the Jerusalem municipality, I was challenged by doing 2 or 3 neighborhood master plans in East Jerusalem. And I actually, since I brought the civic society and the population into the Arab population into this planning process, this creates a lot of complex work. There were no acceptation between both parts, the municipality as an authority, Israeli, and the Arab population who are not represented into the Israeli policy or politics. They have no representation. So you are doing the work involving the community, but you have no control on the result, because at least if you do all the work, and as we did in this master plan, and we succeeded to do a good work with the local community, at least who is taking the decision is another one. It's actually who doesn't really want you to be part of this urban complexity. So I found myself doing a lot of work with an amount of energy, but without succeeding to realize it. And this, I've been called as a troublemaker, as an architect. I'm always bringing a lot of, resistance in the community. So I was forced to leave Jerusalem because many of my projects were stopped by the municipality. And I found that going to a place where I can have a little bit more freedom in a quite big city, and I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that Tel Aviv / Jaffa is representing the liberation, I would say. And there I couldn't. They asked me to come and to work there, actually, and to work especially for Jaffa. Now I found myself with quite good work doing new architecture for Jaffa and trying to bring some new ideas to the modernized with a local language, architecture language in Jaffa. But at least I found that to live is neither or Jaffa or Jerusalem were the right place. We choose to go to Neve Shalom because it's a place where Jewish and Arab live as a microcosm for the Israeli society. And I'm happy to be here because here we can finally realize this one, if you want, community of Jewish and Arab trying to innovate a new example for together living and so on.
You know, for me, your move to Neve Shalom exactly expresses a kind of optimism that we need to have about the future. As you know me over this last decade, I am pathologically optimistic. And for me, challenges are opportunities. And the fact that you have have anchored yourself now to Neve Shalom means that it's not about Jaffa instead of Jerusalem. In fact, Jerusalem remains with all the potential that it has always had. And really, the last thing I want to discuss together is your forming idea for a new institute for the study of Arab culture and the visual arts, architecture, and design, something which for me is very exciting. And because of our work in the Jerusalem Foundation, which is really about embracing the rich cross-communal texture of Jerusalem as a model for the rest of the world, the idea of an institute which wants to examine the strength and beauty of these threads of Arab culture across the arts today is something that's quite exciting. So can you just mention a little bit about your vision for this institute?
I'm happy to thank you for this question, because I think that after 22 years academic experience, but also professional one, and especially when I trained a lot of this informality of architecture and urban planning vis-a-vis the formal planning, I found that there is a big gap, and even there is even quite no idea about this Arabic heritage of not just architecture, art in general, and visual art, and literature, and so on. And the idea of the institute is actually to establish this kind of knowledge into the and to integrate it into the Israeli academy, and to bring or to open to our student to complete the discourse and to influence the discourse within the academic research with Arabic knowledge about history and other fields. I mean, I think that we know very few in Israel about the Arab world and the Arab history. It's quite Orientalistic how we learn it, and I do believe that the Arab themselves have to be part of this discourse, and not just to learn what they ought to absorb the Western education or culture. We can also be part of making the world a better place, actually, at least.
Well, you know that I endorse that vision completely. And actually, I want now to invite Tariq Masood to join us for this last part of the discussion, because this is exactly one of the subjects that Tariq and I discuss all the time, about really seeing Jerusalem as a platform where you can bring together all of these threads, all of these cross-communal threads, where Jerusalem can be a pretty exceptional example. And I do agree completely with you that looking at this long heritage of design and architecture through history in the region can be very exciting for looking at what's going to come next. So Tariq, do you want to join us? And perhaps you have a comment to make.
Thanks. Thanks very much, James and Senan, for a really tremendous and illuminating discussion. Senan, I'm really interested. You know, James and I have an ongoing tension in our discussions where James views, I think correctly, Jerusalem as this extraordinarily beautiful place full of possibilities of cross-cultural commingling and communion. And I definitely see that. He's converted me to that. But I also see in Jerusalem the flip side, a dark side that is about the hardening of boundaries between people, etc. And what has been interesting in the conversation that you and James have had is that we've seen both of these sides. And so you've definitely talked about your own work as the fruit of that kind of cultural fusion that happens in an extraordinary place like Jerusalem. But then you also talked about how politics limited your ability to really fully express that and embody that. And I was wondering if you might just talk a little bit more about your experiences with the municipality and what exactly happened.
Well, maybe few people know that master plan of Jerusalem, I mean the Great Jerusalem, how the Israeli like to call it, with it include all of these historic villages, Arab villages also, from Beit Safafa until Beit Hanina and Shafat and so on, is based on one of its rules is to limit the natural Arab population growth and what we call actually a demographic balance. So it is formally written in this master plan that the Arab population cannot be more than 30%, maybe today 35 or whatever, because it's naturally became during the time a bigger population. And the fact that the planning based on this concept means that you can't expand any Arab neighborhood in an urban plan. What happened in reality, that what I all the time try to explain, instead of this, is that people are constructing all the time, and by this became this informal phenomena. Informality is, by the way, is a very old historic thing that happened everywhere in the world. Mexico City, in Cairo, as you know, Tariq, where you know, you have the ashwaiyat, what you call, and so on. But every time it comes from a different reason. It's about economical reason, about immigration reason in Istanbul city, in Mexico City, because of this, to move or to the migration to the big city and so on. In Jerusalem, the informality comes not because of economical or immigration. It comes because of this restriction, not to allow the Arab population to exercise or to experience their natural living. So many of the new generation are moving out of Jerusalem, going to Bethlehem, going to Ramallah, as you know, and so on. And when I came with this, experience to work on a new plan for one or two neighborhoods, I was facing this, at least this, the core of this concept is not to give these new emerging settlements the right to build as much as they can. I mean what we call nominal number of normal growth. So you can plan what you want, and at the end you cannot succeed with this planning. So this was very frustrating. I cannot go. I actually in a time I was considered as a collaborator. If I'm working with the municipality, so I'm against the citizen. But all the time I was actually trying to do my best to plan in better condition for the population. And when it's fallen down, so I couldn't continue doing this.
You know, Senan, and by the way, I should invite people. We have a little bit of time for questions. So if you raise your hand, we'll be able to call on you, and you'll be able to ask a question of Senan or James. But you know, Senan, you mentioned that this last point about somebody in your position being in that kind of in between space between the Arab community and the Palestinian community and the citizenry of Israel. That on the one hand, as you work with the municipality of Jerusalem, you bump up against some hard limits there, but then you also referred to the fact that the mere fact of working with the municipality is sufficient to render you a collaborator in the eyes of some of your fellow Palestinians. Do you see that latter phenomenon? Do you see any potential for that um, to be to lessen? To how can somebody like you, who has so much obviously to contribute to the Palestinians, both who live in Israel and who live in the West Bank, how can you transcend that initial impulse that people might have to see you because you're somebody who fuses East and West, to see you as somebody who's bringing something alien, somebody who's accommodating, call it what you will, occupation, etc. What's the strategy for transcending that?
I think this is how I came to this institutional work, in a sense to make the individual involvement, to transform it into a collective one, and based on knowledge and even to start with the academy, with the education. I believe that since I'm teaching before I started in Tel Aviv University in the 90s and 2000, and now I'm in Bezalel in Jerusalem, I'm now meeting my students working in these municipalities in Tel Aviv, and I'm sorry to say that that most of them are going out of Jerusalem instead of staying there. But I believe that anyway, if this kind of work will come institutionally and collectively, so I think that we can at least influence some of this policy, because the population will stay there, and you have to transform the place into urban. You can't keep it informal all the time. It's a kind of damage and for the city. So I believe this have to be a collective effort.
You know, if I could just jump in here, this is why I find Senan's idea for the Institute so exciting. Because, in a funny way, it is this sort of tension between formality and informality. And an institute like this is an opportunity to percolate ideas with those rising in the system. So you're not making it academic per se, but you are allowing this kind of thinking to percolate. And in this way, informality becomes the next new formality. And instead of beating your head against the wall of a kind of hierarchy that won't change quickly, you can actually open the door through creative thinking about architecture and design. And it's happening already. This can be our next, in our second discussion, we can talk with excitement about how this is already happening, and students are rising and they are producing work which is doing this. So it's not about whether or not a municipal administration is saying yes or no to something. It is that it is happening, and it will become the next glossary of architecture and urban planning in the region.
That's great. So we have some questions. So again, just to familiarize everybody with this system that we're probably all very familiar with, you can raise your hand by clicking on the bottom of the screen, the participants tab, and you'll see something will open up on the right hand side of your screen, allowing you to raise your hand. So the first question I have is from John Lamb, and so I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. Go ahead, sir.
Thanks for a very interesting discussion. I was just wondering, is it mere serendipity that your first name is Senan, or were you actually named for Senan Pasha?
That's the first question I asked him when we met, by the way.
Senan is originally an Arab name. It's a very old, may you help me, Tariq, with interpreting or explaining what Jahili, before the Islam.
Yeah, pre-Islamic, it means like arrowhead or spear point or something.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. So the Turkish or the Ottoman took it in their, language or culture.
So purely coincidental. purely coincidental that you are named after the
Yeah.
greatest Ottoman architect.
I never thought that I would be as an architect, as I mentioned.
It's incredible.
Tarek, nothing is a coincidence.
That's
Sometimes it just takes time to recognize the plan.
Yeah.
okay. Was that the question, John, or was there a follow up to that? Sorry, you're muted, John.
That was the question.
Okay, great question. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure. Okay, next person I have is our pre-doctoral fellow at the Middle East Initiative, Chagai Weiss. Go ahead, Chagai.
Hi, Senan, James, and Tarek. It's great seeing everyone. So, Senan, I had a question for you. To what extent do you think that the nature of Palestinian architecture within Israel is impacted by the fact that students, for the most part, attend Israeli Jewish institutions like the Technion, Tel Aviv University, Hebrew, B'Tzalel, and so on and so forth. And then when they start practicing, their development has to go through bureaucracies and committees that are explicitly Israeli and explicitly Jewish. And to what extent, do you think that, or are you hoping that the new institute that you're opening is going to shape and shift the nature of Palestinian architecture in Israel?
Again, I hope that our involvement and maybe more and more academic and institutional work as artists and architects and intellectual in general, Palestinian intellectual in Israel, but also in the West Bank, and so can be much more appreciated in order to bring this discourse I mentioned. And as I said, I have now 2 or 3 courses at B'Tzalel that I see that many Israeli or Israeli students are tracked and showing very big interest to know. And they say that it's not anymore Orientalism. It's now the right. I mean, you come with the origin if you want discourse. It's not to look on the place, but from the place itself. Yeah. So we have to do a lot of research and to go to document and to analyze and to open a whole spectrum of knowledge about the Arab culture in general.
Great. Senan, I have a question here in the chat that I'll read to you. So this colleague is asking, what connections do you see between the change in attitudes to architecture as you described it and the potential change among young people's views about engaging across communities?
Well, first of all, what's important to do is not to continue imitating and looking at visuals and journalism, but to go and to look deep and above all to make a serious research in order to bring this cultural heritage into the contemporary discourse. And for this, you need really to make a big movement into the academy, not just with 1 or 2 courses, but realize that this is part of this context. And this is, I believe that if you influence the education, this can bring people on a different level and to stop the antagonism or this way of superiority, looking at indigenous in such a way.
Senan and James, I'd actually be interested in your view on this, and then we should probably wrap up. But, one of the things that I find fascinating whenever I go to Israel and the West Bank is that is a place where this fusion of East and West, which is something that I think I'm just genetically engineered to yearn for and to appreciate. It's everywhere in Israel, and in particularly, when one visits Jerusalem, whether the architecture or is new or old, there's an authenticity to all of it, right? That, there's this emphasis. Your building, for example, which is very much a modern, you build modern buildings, but they are very authentic. They look organic. They look like they emerge from that landscape. And that's frankly been my experience of all of the architecture in Jerusalem. It really does. The new and the old feels very authentic. And I want to ask you, as an Arab, to compare, what has been done in Jerusalem and the preservation of a kind of architectural vernacular in Jerusalem with another holy city, which is, my holy city, which is Mecca. And what we see in Mecca is not that at all. What we observe is the erecting of grand edifices and big clock tower that looks almost like Big Ben, etc. And so the provocation I want to render here is, when we see in Jerusalem that the Israeli authorities impose a kind of architectural vernacular that is authentic, right? Are they expressing an idea that is actually Western, a kind of Western belief in having an architecture that melds with and emerges from the landscape, and that, in fact, when we Arabs are left to our own devices and can choose whatever architecture we want, we actually don't pay any attention to authenticity?
Well, in Israel, there were historically some cultural, especially architectural movement since the establishment, even before the establishment of the State of Israel, when the Jewish architect came from Europe, from especially Germany and the Bauhaus. They started thinking about architecture in a very modernist way. They brought the international and Bauhaus style to Tel Aviv and many other places, of course. But with the time, I guess, after the establishment of the Israeli state, there became also a movement which criticized this movement that they brought the European international student. They believe that they have to be or to belong to the origin of the nature or heritage of the nature of the place. And it was, they spoke about the Palestinian history of architecture, and they even tried to imitate it. You can, in Jerusalem, see in many parts of or neighborhood that they use this stone, hammered stones, that it's shaped by this plasticity, and it was handmade work actually. And by this they create the most facades of the building. The proportion of the building tried to be as much as proportional to the site, not the high-rise building and units and so on. So I think that during this modern history, there were different cultural architecture movement. They have discussion, serious discussion about the identity of architecture. And this is still until today. I mean, it keeps until today, but the question is, how can we shape a new and invent a new language to our commons or sharing together from these different identities which come from everywhere in the world within the Palestinian into a new architecture. This is where my interest is.
It's really interesting because Senan's comment, Tarek, your question and Senan's response bring us full circle for this fall's series, because really the answer to this question is about the power of place. And over time, what gives Jerusalem this power is that it's a city built of its bedrock. And in the Mandate period, they did dictate that everything would be built of Jerusalem stone. And what it actually meant was that you could be forgiving in some ways about the quality of architecture. It could be good or bad, but in the end, what you saw looking across the landscape was a city rising from its bedrock, built of its bedrock. And this idea of rusticated stone, which is part of a long, long Palestinian tradition, and the way that Palestinian stonework is accomplished is something that it's beautiful and it is powerful. And that is what gives Jerusalem this meaning that it has when you see it and when you experience it. And it is about power of place. And what Senan says about letting this percolate, having students grow up to embrace this heritage and then create new architecture based on these tools, on this toolkit. This is what will take us to the future. And so, Senan, thank you for that comment. It really, for me, it was a very nice conclusion to all these conversations this fall.
Thank you again for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. Hope to see you in other sessions.
Thank you so much, Senan and James. We had some other folks who had questions, but we're not going to be able to get to them. But hopefully we'll have other opportunities to engage with Senan in the near future, and so many more opportunities to ask questions and to explore his fertile mind. So thank you all. I hope you all have a great holiday and a happy new year, and we'll look forward to reconvening in the spring when our emergence from this coronavirus nightmare will be ever closer. So until then, thank you all. Thank you again, Senan. That was really wonderful.
Happy Christmas and thank you.
All right. Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.
And Tarek, thank you for this fall series. It's been a real pleasure to do
James,
this.
thank you. You're the mastermind, and it really has been a great pleasure. All right, everybody. Bye-bye.